In this fifth section of the mental status examination training, we will learn about speech. My name is Tom Field, and I produced and narrated this training series. Let's return to the overview. In this training series, we'll learn via a scaffolding process. In this section of the training, we'll learn about speech, and during guided practice activities, we'll review affect and mood, thought process, memory, and motor movement. At the conclusion of the 8 sections is an end of training test. I encourage you to follow the handout as we progress. You can use scrap paper for guided practice if you like. There's also a sheet available for this. And as you watch the video case studies during guided practice activities, there may be instances where a section of the mental status examination is not fully apparent, and in those instances, it's okay to indicate unable to assess. Speech is defined as the content and delivery of verbal communication. There are 4 aspects of speech that we're going to be looking at in this training. Rate and rhythm, we'll be looking at regular and pressured speech. Content, we'll be looking at laconic speech. Organization, we'll be looking at disorganized speech. And odd or eccentric, and we'll be looking at coprolalia and echolalia. Not covered in this training but important are stuttering and neologisms. Stuttering is when a person trips over words and struggles to fully articulate their desired verbal communication. Neologisms are new words that are often spontaneously generated, often by people with schizophrenia. Let's look at speech. Regular rate and rhythm of speech is described as controlled, even-paced verbal communication. This can interweave with another person's dialogue. Let's watch an example.
Lately, I haven't been eating at all, not much at all, and I've been sleeping all the time.
In this example, the person has an even pace and a controlled rate and rhythm of speech. This conversational verbal communication style is known as regular rate and rhythm of speech. Pressured speech is described as uncontrollable, accelerated, excessive talking. The person often has a rapid rate and rhythm and is difficult to interrupt. The person may feel like they cannot talk fast enough. This is common to anxiety and manic states found in bipolar disorder.
So how was your week?
Oh, my week was really stressful. We have this big safety inspection coming up at work, and it's been a lot of pressure, and honestly I've been kind of overwhelmed because we have to audit all of our files, and we have to check all the machines to make sure that they're working and make sure everybody's training is up to date, and not everybody's trained, and frankly some of these people, it's just going to be really hard to get them up to speed. It's just going to be really difficult, and some of our files are out of order, so we're having to have interns work on that, and trying to coordinate all these people is just a humongous mess. I mean, it's just such a mess. But I'm hoping that we'll do okay on the inspections, since we did okay last year and the year before. But 3 years ago was a different story because we had a different manager, and he didn't really keep track of things, and some of the machines weren't working when they came, so we had to get that up to speed. But really the last couple of years we've been up on that, and we bought the new machines that we needed to buy. So now it's just a matter of getting the people up to speed, and that's kind of what I'm in charge of, is kind of coordinating the whole thing.
So going back a second, if we could go,
it's just difficult when you have these
we could
people
go
that are
back
not
to
very
your
well
week.
trained, and they're they don't have a whole lot of education.
Well, hold on a second. Let's go back.
And like just having to plan the trainings for all of these people.
Could we go back a second?
This client seems to be struggling to get all of their words out. They seem to feel pressured to talk fast enough. This accelerated pace and excessive speech is difficult to interrupt by the interviewer. This is known as pressured speech. Laconic speech is described as terse, brief responses that are provided without elaboration. No unprompted information is given. This is also known as poverty of speech. This is associated with avoidance and also oppositional or defiant behavior.
So tell me how your week's been.
That's alright.
What'd you get up to?
Just the usual.
And you had mentioned last week that you were expecting some stress at your job. How did that go?
It was okay.
Did some things come up that were stressful?
Oh no, not really.
This client provides brief, terse responses and does not elaborate even when prompted. This poverty of speech can greatly impact the counseling relationship evident in the video, as the clinician may feel they are trying to almost prize words out of the client and feel they are working too hard. Disorganized speech is described as disconnected, unintelligible speech. It is associated with dementia, delirium, schizophrenia, and substance abuse.
I was sandwiches without any gas in the tank, and then Red Riding Hood lives in the woods, just like the snakes on a plane.
This client's speech is difficult to follow. Because the ideas are so disconnected, the verbal content also indicates the presence of flight of ideas. In this case, speech intersects with thought process. As an aside, if a client manifests multiple symptoms of something like schizophrenia, for example, such as flight of ideas and disorganized speech, we have reason for concern. Coprolalia is described as involuntary use of vulgar or obscene language, found in Tourette syndrome. Coprolalia can also consist of grunts and paralanguage, for example, ah, grr, shh. Let's watch an example.
So, this couch at Macy's, shit, I like that, I like the color, I like the way it matches in the room. Shit.
The client here is trying to talk about the couch she bought at Macy's and is interrupted by intrusive, involuntary verbal tics. When these tics are either vulgar or obscene, or paralanguage, then coprolalia is indicated. Echolalia is described as repeating or mirroring the speech of another person. For example, repeating back a question instead of answering the question. This is associated with autism spectrum disorders. Let's watch an example.
So what would you like to talk about today?
So what would you like to talk about today?
I was thinking maybe we could talk about how your week's been.
How your week's been?
The client here is staring off with no eye contact. Moreover, the client repeats full phrases and also partial phrases of the interviewer. This mirroring is known as echolalia. It's now time for guided practice as you try your hand at coding speech. In this first video case study, you're going to code affect, mood, thought process, memory and consciousness, motor movement, and speech. And for speech, you'll code regular rate and rhythm, or pressured, or laconic, or disorganized, or coprolalia, or echolalia. Let's watch the first video.
My neighbor is so loud. It's making me so angry. I talk to him and he just doesn't turn it down. He just doesn't turn the music down. And then there's the lawnmower guy, but the lawnmower guy is really hot. But he takes his shirt off, and I just don't know if that's appropriate. I'm just not sure. I told him to put his shirt back on, but he just wouldn't listen to me. He just turned me off. And it's the neighbor, The neighbor's so loud.
Pause the video now and assess the client for affect, mood, thought process, memory and consciousness, motor movement, and speech. Okay, for affect here, the client has a blunted or flat affect. Despite their obvious dysphoric mood, their irritability, it's not quite apparent what they're feeling inside, just because of their little facial expression of the emotion. The only way that we would know the client is really irritable, besides their vocal tone, is their head bobbing. And so they have a blunted or flat affect. In terms of form of thought, their thought process, we could code here circumstantial, because they begin talking about their anger towards their neighbor, their loud neighbor, and become distracted or derailed by thoughts about a lawnmower man who takes his shirt off. But eventually the client does go back to the neighbor right at the conclusion of the clip. The client may also be ruminating, by the way. We'd need more information about this. But the degree to which she says the neighbor, the neighbor, the neighbor at the end indicates the possibility of rumination. It's unclear as to whether her memory is intact or not. We would indicate unable to assess for memory. She does seem to have a relaxed motor movement, and in terms of her speech we would indicate pressured, both because of the speed of her speech, her rate of speech, and also because it's very difficult for the interviewer to interrupt. Let's watch the second video.
So what have you gotten up to this past week?
Not much.
You had mentioned that you were going to go out with one of your friends.
Yeah.
Pause the video now and assess the client for affect, mood, thought process, memory and consciousness, motor movement, and speech. This client's affect is again blunted or flat. It's hard to know their exact emotion based on their facial expression. We might indicate here depressed or dysphoric because they do seem anxious. If you look at the image in front, it might indicate that. But because of the flatness, the bluntedness of their affect, it's not quite clear. So I would indicate unable to assess for mood. In terms of thought process, they seem to be somewhat preoccupied. Despite the interviewer's attempts, the client does seem fairly internally focused. We would indicate preoccupied here, by the way, rather than catatonia or dissociation, because even though the client does appear to be staring off, there is some degree of movement or response. And in terms of dissociation, the client does not completely respond to the interviewer, almost snap out of a trance the way you might expect. I guess because the client does not seem to be completely in a trance, we wouldn't indicate either of those. The memory of the client we are unable to assess at this time. It's not exactly clear what's going on there with memory. In terms of their motor, we would indicate psychomotor retardation. There is a slowness, a dullness of response, and their speech is laconic. Let's watch the third video.
I was really stressed at last week I was at the movies and there was a rainbow. It was raining, and I saw my friend Sam at the popcorn, and sometimes think a lot that, there's a cat outside, but it doesn't see me, and the rug was really red with some blue on it.
Pause the video now and assess the client for affect, mood, thought process, memory and consciousness, motor movement, and speech. The client's affect here is full or broad. Their anxiety, their dysphoria, is clearly evident in their facial feature. If you watch the screen in front of you, the client seems anxious. And so we would indicate full or broad and congruent here. We would indicate dysphoria or dysphoric for mood because of the anxiety. Her thought process seems to be, you could either indicate very loose associations or flight of ideas. My gut would be more flight of ideas here, just because of the complete lack of connection between content, between ideas. In terms of memory, we're unable to assess. There may be memory problems here, but we'd need more information. Her motor movement seems fairly relaxed, and her speech seems disorganized. As an aside, it can take a while to identify disorganized speech. It wasn't until the client mentioned the cat outside that I fully identified the disconnected, unintelligible speech known as disorganized speech in the client. And therefore, sometimes we need to listen to a client for a prolonged period, perhaps a minute or more, to fully understand the exact nature of their speech. So let's review. Today we learned about rate and rhythm of speech, looking at regular and pressured speech. We looked at content and the lack of, known as laconic speech. We looked at organization and the lack of, known as disorganized speech. And we also looked at odd or eccentric speech, looking at both coprolalia and echolalia. This concludes the 5th section of the mental status examination training.